Srikanth, you must say something in Chinese today.
Yes, and this has become really a tension. Some Telugu channel will ask me to speak in Telugu and a Hindi channel in Hindi, and CGTN was asking me to speak in Chinese, which I did. And so this is becoming and sometimes I suddenly blurt out something in Telugu.
Sorry, stand by. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, we're live now. Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. We're live on YouTube. I'm Faye D'Souza. Thank you for joining us. I want to first begin by apologizing to my viewers for not being able to put out a show for the last 1 week. I was dealing with some personal issues, but we're back now. And so much has happened in this last 1 week, least of which is what happened at the Galwan Valley between India and China. Now, I'm sure you've read about the news stories, you read about the Prime Minister's comment that followed, and the confusion that followed the Prime Minister's comment. The attempt with this conversation that I bring to you today is to help us understand a little better 3 or 4 things. First of all, India's relationship with China and how it has gotten to this point. Secondly, the backdrop against which the Galwan Valley incident has taken place. Why the line of actual control is not exactly a border with specified limits and what that means to that relationship, what India's options are going forward, and what the Prime Minister's comment would have as an impact on the relationships between India and China and the diplomatic conversations that are taking place between the 2 countries. So here are the 3 main questions we're going to attempt to tackle in the next 1 hour. First of all, what was China's strategic goal in Galwan Valley? So was the Galwan Valley incident a one-off incident, or is there a larger play here that China is aiming at? Why would they do it at this time? And what is really going on? The second question that I'm going to ask my panel is this: what impact will the Prime Minister's statement have on Indo-China relationships? Remember, the Prime Minister issued a statement saying that there was no incursion and there was no one on India's land or territory. So what does that mean? Because we know that China and Chinese media picked that up immediately and used it as sort of a vindication. The third question that we will deal with today is what options does India have as this path forward from this point? Remember, for the last several decades, India has been using diplomatic solutions for the 2 or 3 bust-ups that we've had so far. Will this be a diplomatic solution as well? And what options lie on the table for India? I'm really, really pleased to be able to introduce our panel for this evening. Now, to remind our viewers, this is not a debate. A debate would be into people at the opposite ends of a particular point, actually, in most cases on television, trying to shoot each other down, speaking louder than the other. This is not that. This is a discussion with an attempt to understand the issue better. So I've got for you 3 very, very educated voices with an attempt to help us, as young as we are, understand the history of what is going on. Commodore Uday Bhaskar is a retired military officer who served in the Indian Navy for 37 years. He's one of India's leading experts and outspoken critics on security and strategic affairs. He's a columnist and editor and a contributor to numerous research articles, and he understands India's relationship with China strategically very, very well. My second panelist, Srikanth Kondapalli, is a professor in Chinese studies at JNU. He's a frequent writer and commentator on national and international media. He's an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. He's a research associate at the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. He served at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis in Delhi for 12 years, and he's a visiting professor at the National Chengchi Institute University, I beg your pardon, in Taipei. My third panelist is Mr. Mohan Guruswamy. He's the chairperson and founder of the Center for Policy Alternatives, former advisor to the Finance Minister of India in 1998. He's a policy analyst studying economic and security issues, and he's held senior positions in government. He specializes in the Chinese economy, and he's written 2 books. He's authored 2 books about India's relationship with China, both economically and strategically. So we couldn't have hoped for a better panel of voices. So I'm really happy that we brought the three of them together. So gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us your time and welcome to this conversation. I'm going to start with my first question, which is, was the Galwan Valley incident a one-off incident, or is there a larger strategic play here by China? And I'll start by asking the question to Mr. Kondapalli. Mr. Kondapalli, good evening. Do you believe that there's a larger strategy here that China is playing out? And if yes, what is it?
Well, I think for the past few years, there has been a contest between India and China in the border areas. We have seen, for example, the 2013 Depsang Plains incident for 3 weeks in 2013, then followed up by Chumar in Uttaranchal, Himachal, Tibet areas. It is then followed by a spectacular transgression in the Doklam area of Bhutan-China border areas. These have told us that the borders are not really quiet. These are not really peaceful. There is a lot of other tensions brewing up in the midst of these two countries. Number one, these were all followed by major exercises. For instance, the Doklam crisis resulted in the Indian Air Force mobilizing over 1,100 aircraft. It was reported in the press that they have punctured the air superiority functions of the PLA Air Force in Tibet during that time. During the President Xi Jinping's visit to Chennai last year, there was the Him Vijay exercises with the integrated defense staff, basically joint operations, a brigade level exercises. These were again followed in Leh, in Ladakh, of the exercises, high altitude mountainous exercises. So the contest is on between the two in terms of testing their power in the region, number one. And this is partly because, I guess, the instituting of a nationalist government since 2014 in Delhi, but also a highly nationalist government in China since the 18-party Congress in 2012. So the nationalisms are clashing here in Galwan, in Pankung So. So this is one larger picture that I could visualize. There are others who one can mention, the CPEC projects, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor projects. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, and in 2014 they have the CPEC, and 23 out of 42 projects have been completed with nearly $42 billion out of $62 billion. If you look at the Galwan, Pankung So Lake areas, as the crow flies, it would be 200 to 300 kilometers away are these CPEC projects. And not far away is the DBO Darbuk Shiok 225 kilometer long road. So again, there is a contest here that is reflected, and various reports have suggested China has been very unhappy with the road construction, especially with the feeder lines from the DBO Darbuk Shiok line to the LAC feeder lines could have provided ample strength for India to mobilize forces towards the LAC. Thirdly, they have also mentioned, some scholars, others, mentioned about the larger strategic picture, that is the 18-month sapping of the US-China tariff wars and the COVID-19, which we are all suffering. The IMF had estimated to about $8.5 trillion decline in global economy in terms of the output value of goods and services. And this is the moment where China has been very assertive in terms of the national security law in Hong Kong, the South China Sea ADIZ preparation, Air Defense Identification Zone. There are also over 621 transgressions in Senkaku Islands, which resulted in Japan recently mobilizing its Patriot advanced combat systems, a ballistic missile system, low altitude air defense system that they deployed, and also reflected in the South China Sea, where they have the Haiyang Teacher 8, HD8 vessels, which have intruded into the Vietnamese, Malaysian, Filipino waters. So overall assertiveness in the background of the COVID-19 is also suggested to be one of the reasons. At a time when the Trump administration is withdrawing in the international domain, this provides a chance for China to gobble up the space that is vacated as part of the TPP, climate change, the Human Rights Council, now the threat to walk away from WHO or other WTO dispute mechanisms, others. This provides space for China to circulate around. And of course, they now face stiff opposition from India.
Well, before I move to the other guests, Mr. Kondapalli, quick question. There was also one theory that said that because India exercised Balkot and we did the airstrikes that flew very close to the areas of the road construction and the CPAC construction that's going on, China felt the need to sort of shore up its positions there. Is that possibly a reaction to 2 or 3 things that India has done in Kashmir or around Kashmir in the last couple of years?
I think there is a connection, although the causal connection is yet to be established, meaning the Uri surgical strikes, the Balakot strikes, indicated, and as the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval mentioned in a Mumbai seminar, that India is now planning to not to punch below or not to punch above the belt, but punching appropriately. So an expression that he used in a Mumbai seminar suggested that India is making some efforts on utilizing the military power that it has at its disposal, and clubbed with Dr. Jaishankar when he was the foreign secretary, his speech in Singapore on India wanting to play a leading role, as he said in this seminar in Singapore, suggested that there is also the Indian effort. But as I mentioned, the larger Chinese assertiveness on the issues that we discussed is providing the backdrop for India as well to display its power so that it becomes a credible deterrence for any invader or any who is challenging that strength.
Right. Let me just take this to Commodore Uday Bhaskar as well. Commodore Bhaskar, good evening and thank you for joining us. There have been some mentions of a two-front war or a two-front sort of India being alert on 2 fronts, at least. Let's put it that way. There is a lot of nervousness among citizens of how this may escalate, what this means. I mean, we've had enough talk in the media about India and Pakistan, but the idea of India and China is something that I know even on my timeline right now, people are writing in saying, is this something we can afford to do? Do we know if we can take on China? So just to sort of settle that nervousness. Do you expect this to escalate? And if it does, given COVID, given social distancing, given the fact that everyone has worked from home for the last 3-4 months, are we ready?
First of all, I would say that as far as the Indian military is concerned, it's always ready, depending on the nature of the exigency, even if their own material resources and inventory are not up to the level that we all desire. And a good illustration is what happened in Kargil, if you remember, in 1999, where General Malik, then as the chief, had made the statement saying that irrespective of what be the material constraints, the Indian Army acquitted itself with aplomb. So did the other two services. So that's point one. I want to assert this, that the Indian military would always be ready. But going back to the larger question, will this escalate? Are we likely to have a high intensity conventional war, one with China? And will this extend into the equivalent of a two-front war, which is the worst case scenario that has often been painted in India, that the Indian military would have to deal with China on one side and Pakistan, both the regular forces and the irregulars, the extension of the proxy war that we have dealt with for decades. As an analyst, I would say the probability is relatively low at this stage as we speak today on the 22nd of June. But I also will concede that this is a very volatile kind of situation just now because of various reports, some confirmed, not confirmed, about the nature of the buildup along the LAC, which is a very, very long stretch. It's more than 3,700, 800 kilometers all the way from the Himalayas to the east. So to that extent, I want to be cautious and say that also to allay any kind of anxiety, that to me, the probability is low. But may I extend this, Faye, if you allow me, to say that, you started this discussion about the objectives of China, the tactical objectives and the strategic objective. I'd like to sort of make a few comments there. On the other hand, if you want me to hold just now and come back to this issue later.
No, please go ahead. What you believe are the strategic objectives, yes.
Okay, to my mind, the way I see it is that if you look at the way in which Galwan happened, Galwan is only one, shall we say, incident, one location. The gist of what has happened is that we had the PLA, Chinese incursions, Chinese transgression, whatever word you want to use, across a wide stretch. It is from Ladakh all the way down towards Sikkim. So it's multiple locations. And therefore, if you were to reconstruct this, it's very clear that this was premeditated, very well planned. And again, I would say that India was not able to anticipate this. So therefore, they have made certain tactical gains. If you look at this, I don't want to sort of detain this discussion with references to maps and fingers and lakes and whatever. The short point is that at that level of altitude, and if you look at that terrain, today, China has positioned itself in a far more favorable way, just tactically at this point in time, in that particular area from Ladakh to Sikkim. Now, for India, we have to, I think, do a cost-benefit analysis, which is your third question. What are the options and so on? I'm sure we'll come to that later. But I link this tactical, shall we say, initiative, this particular step that China has taken with a larger strategic objective. And to my mind, that larger strategic objective is, and this is actually building on some of the points that Srikanth had just mentioned, that for the last year plus, roughly you might say from Modi 2.0 onwards, after Prime Minister Modi came back in the second term, there have been various Indian actions which have, in a way, added to both the anxiety and the ire on the Chinese side. And one can list them if you go back, including J&K, what happened in terms of the reorganization, India's relationship with the United States. And as I said, there are other incidents where China had reason to feel it needed to send a signal to India. So this is abiding to my mind. From 1962 to where 2020, there is a reality that this long 3,800 odd kilometer LAC, as we call it, is actually about a territorial dispute, which has very deep embedded layers, in terms of how India and China perceive each other, how India and China look at territoriality in terms of their own self-image, and the way in which this is projected in the domestic political context. The extrapolation is that within the region, in Asia, is China's objective to allow the equivalent of, whether you call it a multipolar or a polycentric Asia, where there is place for everybody, or is China committed to the goal of a unipolar Asia, where China is the number one power, and therefore whether it's a Japan or an India, they would have to either defer or accept this kind of a profile of China, which they hope to attain, say, by 2049, which is 100 years of the communist regime from 1949. So to my mind, there is a larger strategic objective, and it's a very macro objective. And whatever China has done over the last few years tactically, again, I would say, including the relationship with Pakistan, what it has done in relation to Pakistan's nuclear weapons, the support, the terrorism, all of that put together, or the string of pearls, as it is referred to, China's forays into the Indian Ocean. This is all part, I think, of a larger game plan in which China would like to project itself as the undisputed power in Asia. And India is definitely seen at this point in time as a country, a nation, which needs to be sent a very strong signal. And that, to my mind, is the larger, shall we say, interpretation of what has happened over the last 2 months from roughly the third week of April in terms of the Chinese incursions, the Chinese movement from that entire strip, as I said, from Ladakh all the way up to Sikkim. So let me pause here and, we can perhaps visit some of the other issues. Faye?
Very well said. Thank you. I just want to bring in Mr. Mohan Guruswamy here at this point. Mr. Guruswamy, picking up from what the Commodore just said, that there were a series of things that India chose to do that might have put China on edge, including, making changes in Kashmir. Apparently, the map that was released at that time was one of the reasons that might have raised some eyebrows on the other side of the border. India's proximity or growing closeness with the US. Do you believe that these were moves that were taken, keeping in consideration what this would mean in China, in which case we should have expected some sort of escalation on the border? Or do you think that maybe there were some mistakes that were made on our part?
No, I don't think there was a mistake made on our part because, there's a pattern here. If you take from 2013 onwards, ever since Xi Jinping became president and then started asserting power within China, there's been a pattern of aggressiveness throughout. If you remember, Dr. Manmohan Singh captured this mood very clearly by saying there's a new assertiveness in China. In 2013, there was the Chumar incident. 2014, there was Depsang. So every 6 months or 8 months, there is some event happening on the frontier. And on the Indian frontier, this has started at Galwan, where you have the fish-tailed incident, where they nibbled at something, and then you come to Nathula, you come to a little bit of nibbling near in Arunachal Pradesh, and then the central sector, now in the Ladakh sector. Now, this is a continuous pattern, and this is going on, like Srikanth said, with all neighbors, except the Russians now at this moment. Russia seems to be China's only, quiet neighbor. But the Russians have done their bit 20 years ago, when the Chinese tried to occupy Damansky Island on Dusuri. The Russians dealt them a huge blow and said that they don't take these things lightly and that they will use tremendous force. And Russia is still a class 1 superpower. It's not a hollow superpower like China. So that's one. Two.
So forgive me. So is there something to be read there on the fact that our defense minister has just boarded a plane to Russia for the next 3 days at a time like this?
I don't think so. That is a normal routine visit. He's gone to tie up some supplies of some aircraft and things like that, from what I can understand. But there's also another thing. From a Chinese strategic point of view, if you think of India as a challenger to their primacy in Asia, India is just entering. It was in the high growth phase till we did a series of stupid things like demonetization, etc., where we could have done 7% growth and continued for a while. If you do that 7% growth, you are pretty much the same size as China in about 2045. These projections have been researched and I have also written about it. Mind you, India and China were almost side by side till 1996, 1997. When China just became a $1 trillion economy, we followed 5 years later. But we've slowed down. And this, China still sees this in long term and saying that if these guys have to be tripped, this is the time to trip them. And this, and there's a lot of nationalism about in China. Since I go there so often, I've never seen a more nationalistic country. That, we can do it, we can take on anybody, we're better than anybody. The jingoism is excessive. It's something unbelievable which happens there. And this started after the Olympics, which they conducted in a very grand manner, and superbly organized. And this Chinese growth and development has been quite superb in the last 10 years, particularly, last 20 years, particularly. But having said that, they're going to keep us stripped. Now, Kumar is one end of the Ladakh sector, and DBO is the other end of the Ladakh sector. And they've been nibbling all through. And I consider Galwan a very serious development, because Galwan takes them within 2 kilometers of the Darbuk-DBO road. And the Darbuk-DBO road is a 230-kilometer road along the side of the Shiok River till it turns along the Chipchap River. And it's just, the column is about 5 kilometers wide, because you have the Karakoram spur next to the river. So you're running alongside the mountain. The other side is the Nubra Valley. So if you interdict that road, then you can Chinese, and the PLA can interdict it not only at Galwan, but at several places. But Galwan is very convenient. It's a valley, it's low altitude, you can come in from there. And that means you're cut off from what we call subsector north. This Pangong, so I don't take it, though their nibbling is more blatant, I don't consider that important. I consider that a sideshow to distract us, because those fingers, 8 fingers, are north of the Pangong Lake, and for us to keep supplies going is going to be extremely different. But if Galwan interdiction takes place, then our position in the rest of that sector, including Depsang, DBO, becomes very, very difficult and precarious. Then we will have only one thin track available through the Sasarla Pass to DBO. So that will naturally result. Now this is where I think we have an option. Because we may be disadvantaged on land there, we might have to go to air very fast. And this is where we have strategic advantages. Our airports, which cater to the area, all at the ground level. So which means that your fighters and your fighter bombers can take off with full load of weapons and fuel. Not only they can carry more, but they can loiter for longer on the target. The Chinese bases are all at about 14,000, 15,000 feet, which means that they can't take off with the full load. They burn up a lot more fuel while taking off. And high altitude flying is, when you take off from those places, is very fuel consumptive. So the ranges get limited. So this is where they would not like our Air Force to come. So this is where I see hope that they will back off fast, because it doesn't suit them right now. The Chinese have a pattern of dibbling when it suits them. Oh. And to resolve, they will back off. But we've handled things badly so far. Having said that, for instance, when the PLA started exercising in Ladakh, every year we mirror match them. Our reserves also go up. This year our reserves didn't go up. That's an explanation we need. The country needs to know, why didn't you do it? Why didn't the ITBP report this? Because the channels of communication of the ITBP are to its DIG, to its IG, to the Home Secretary, to the Home Minister, then who informs the Raksha Minister.
Yes.
So there's a long loop. Even in Depsang, after the ITBP reported, it took 2 weeks before the army was
But that brings me sir, to our next question, and I want to introduce the next question to the whole panel, and I'll continue with what you're saying, and then we bring in the rest of the panel. The question is about the Prime Minister's statement, and it caused a fair amount of confusion, because chronologically we were told that we lost 20 of our men in that skirmish. They were very hard, terrible reports of clubs with nails in them, sticks with barbed wire that were used. These men were chased down. Some of them were thrown into a frozen, or had to jump into a frozen river. After all of that, we had a statement from the Prime Minister that said that there was no incursion at all. Chinese media used the statement to sort of vindicate their stand. And then there was a statement from our government saying that it was a mischievous interpretation of what was said. No, obviously, this doesn't answer any of the questions, but what impact will this have now on the diplomatic conversations that have to happen going forward?
I think it's a very unfortunate statement. And he should have made that kind of a wrong statement. It's erroneous. The Chinese have not only come as far as point 14 on the Galwan Valley, they have come pretty deep down the Galwan Valley. At one time, if you remember, in 1962, our post used to be 60 kilometers up. And it's been coming down, and they've been pushing and lifting away. And we've been derelict on sending our patrols up. Because the local forces, the police forces don't report to the army there. The army doesn't know how far they're patrolling. They don't know what they're doing. So there is a breakdown in the command structure there. The other thing is that the PM shouldn't have said that. That's totally wrong. And the Chinese have naturally grabbed onto it, latched onto it. And they're playing it very clever. They also have taken casualties. But when you ask them, they say, no, we don't want to make a fuss about it. We want to keep things down. But there's a lot of chitter-chatter going on in Chinese social media right now as to losses. There have been losses. I don't think the Jawans of 16 Bihar are slouches. They've taken, the biggest, this loss of life is also because, we've not clarified situation. These men were brawling on a ledge. The ledge collapsed and our troops came down. Their troops also came down. They also had hypothermia losses. They also had injuries. Their commanding officer also died. And we also had some of them as POWs with us for a couple of days. And then we returned them back. So all these things happen, you need to come up front. You can't fight a modern technological war on Schwarzkopf rules that I will not tell you, I will not take you into confidence. I will tell you what I think you should know. That is not going to work. Because
okay, let me bring in Mr. Kondapalli. Forgive me. Let me bring in Mr. Kondapalli as well. Mr. Kondapalli, do you agree that the Prime Minister's statement might have caused more confusion than necessary?
I think if you look at the context in the last 50 odd years since the 1962 border clashes, confusion prevailed all over the border, meaning where exactly is the line of actual control? There is no clarity on this. It has been fuzzy, it has been imaginary. Of course, at the ground level, the patrols would know, although they don't carry any GPS. There is, of course, the terrain difficulties. Today, the temperature could have been about -15 minimum in that area. And in a few months, it would be -55 degrees and wind blowing in those Daulat Beg Oldi, tremendous difficulties for the patrols. The line of actual control has been left fuzzy all these years. 62 did not clarify that where exactly is the line of actual control, nor the negotiations or let's say talks since 1981 or the 3 talks that they conducted in Beijing, New Delhi and Rangoon in 1960. 1981, we began the border talks. There was no clarification on the LAC even now. We formulated the joint working group meetings, 15 of them were held, and 22 special representatives. And despite these 40 years of talks, we do not know where the line of actual control is. And still there is a lot of confusion. Where exactly is patrol point 14? The disengagement process is supposed to be, the Chinese would have got away from the point 14 to point 15 which is about 5 kilometers. But they did not withdraw from that place and causing the trouble that we saw in terms of the unfortunate death. So far, even today, we do not have a clear indication of where exactly is the line of actual control.
I don't think so.
Between the two countries.
I think it's very clear where point 14 is, where point 15 is. There's no doubt about it. It's absolutely clear. Everybody, even the ITBP has GPS. So we know where we are at any given time. So, I think that is an erroneous deduction from this. They did come up, they came down. They are 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers away from the junction and from the road. They were never there before. So it is an incursion. There is no doubt there was an incursion.
Hang on, Commodore wants to come in as well. Commodore Bhaskar, go ahead.
Yeah. May I come in, Faye?
Yes,
I just want to add to this. I think, for purposes of our discussion, since we are trying to bring some light, I'd make the observation that as far as India is concerned, we are quite clear about the claim line, as Mohan is just saying. Along this entire length, there is a clarity on the Indian side about our claim. And we are able to carry out these patrols in the manner that the military the army has found appropriate. Yes, there is a Chinese interpretation about their claim lines. And, depending on sector to sector, there has been this standoff which has been going on. So that's one limited point, and I will come back to this later. But I want to revert to the Prime Minister's statement, Faye, if that's okay. May I?
Please, please.
Now, on this, I do want to say that I think, when we have any kind of an operation of this nature, even if it is below the level of a conventional war, information has to be disseminated in a manner that at the level of the national, shall we say, coordination, there is a certain way in which information is made available and various factors are taken into account. Now, the jargon that is often used is we talk about strategic communication during operations, whether it is a full-fledged war or well below that. And if you now look at the way in which this particular part of warfare has evolved, the received wisdom is that you have to dominate the narrative. And the Chinese have spent a lot of time and effort in this. And about 10 years ago, they came up with a framework called the three principles warfare, the three warfare principles, I beg your pardon, of which one element is the narrative, the information, the propaganda, whatever. And they are very, very aware that you need to establish domination on this, both for their domestic audiences, as also for the external interlocutors. Now, in our case, I would say that our handling of the strategic communication has been inadequate. It has been, I think, left a lot to be desired. Starting from April, whenever the government of India at whatever level, whether it was the Home Ministry, the intelligence, the defense got to know about this, I think we were not able to deal with this and disseminate it in the appropriate way. So what happens is that you have a lot of speculation. Now, if you recall what happened in May, 3rd, 4th week of May, there were various reports. And finally, of course, we had the fact that we lost a few soldiers. The first, I would say, cycle was that it was only 3. Then we saw the numbers going up. And this could have been avoided. And I think that way there would have been more trust. So as a result, you saw people trying to interpret satellite imagery that had been obtained from Western sources. People were looking at other experts from different countries and coming up with all kinds of conjecture, which I think from the Indian point of view was undesirable. And this, I think, was compounded by the Prime Minister's statement on Friday, where you had a very anomalous situation where the PM makes a statement. And then in less than 24 hours, there are clarifications being issued. And again, there is a lot of ambiguity about what exactly is being said, which I'm coming back to strategic communication could have been done better. So as a result, I think, on this particular front, you find that we are scrambling. India is trying to explain this, explain that to its own people, to say that, okay, if we have lost 20, you had people saying that, no, they lost 40. This kind of speculation is something that could have been avoided. And I think that when we reconstruct the Galwan experience, I want to add to what Mohan has said, that I think there is a strong case to have the equivalent of a Kargil committee kind of review. Because some of these lapses, for instance, DBO, I hope I can just make this last point and then I'll keep quiet. I think what Mohan said about DBO is very, very critical. If we lose the current, shall we say, advantage that we have in terms of accessing DBO, then it changes the tactical plot in a strategic way. I hope I'm not confusing everyone. If you look at that particular part of the map and the airstrip, what it represents, that particular ability to bring air power. If you lose that for whatever reason, maybe the Chinese have decided, not decided, it constrains India's tactical advantages that we talk about, and that could have a strategic impact. So there are many factors here, and I think the government could have dealt with this by taking maybe the political parties could have been taken into confidence. So you have a very, I would say, undesirable situation where political parties are also asking, clamoring, making statements which should not have been made. And all this, as I said, if you had Stratcom in place, we could have dealt with this in a, I think, more effective.
So let me just allow the other panelists to respond to this before we go to the last question of what the way forward is. Handling of strategic communications on India's part was inadequate. Mr. Kondapalli or Mr. Guruswamy, do either of you want to respond to that?
I think we are making a mountain of the molehill. Did anything on the ground change before or after the Prime Minister's speech? Today we are discussing the Major General level talks. Did anything change on the ground? Did the Chinese mobilize forces after the June 15th incident? Kind of brutal.
If I may ask you a question completely as a lay citizen here, in the conversations that's currently taking place at the Lieutenant General level right now, would it matter, because the other side will say, hey, you know what, you guys have accepted that none of our chaps crossed over to your territory. So technically, does that give the other side an upper hand?
I think these are also part of the communication to the other side. Let us, kind of tone it down. There are also signalings from China. The CGTN came out with a program today, and the Foreign Ministry also made some statements of climbing down on trade issues, on boycott of goods, Chinese goods that Indian side made, or on other fronts. For instance, the signaling from China last 2 days has been, let us tone it down. So I think this is also part of the communication that both sides are trying to, put it to each other.
Mr. Guruswamy?
I think, they are where they are today is where they never were before. Let's get it clear. And I think they are strategically pushing towards what we call the McCartney-MacDonald line of 1905, which was the line which Lord Curzon suggested as a border. The Chinese accepted it then. And they have always been showing that as the border. And the two LACs, because there's no difference on perception. We think our LAC is somewhere, and they think their LAC is somewhere ahead. We think our LAC is behind their LAC. So there are gaps there. In a place like Jepsan, there's a difference of 20 kilometers. In a place like Chumar, it's a few yards. So there is this difference in perception, and they are assertive. If you see a pattern coming from 2012 onwards, with the new leadership in China, this is something which is cause of concern, which is why, forget about Donald Trump, even Barack Obama started looking at the Asia-Pacific region very carefully and then spoke of a pivot. Barack Obama didn't represent typical traditional Jews on these strategic issues, but he recognized something happening with China, And the Chinese argument which many people make here, that they were concerned because of what Amit Shah said in Parliament, change of status in Amit Shah said in Parliament is unfortunate and indiscreet. But the change in status in Jammu Kashmir. The Chinese are doing change in status all over the place. In Xinjiang, they put 1 million people in concentration camps. Tibet, there are changes. In Hong Kong, yesterday they brought a new security regulation. In the rest of the world, they say it's our internal affair. So we can also take a line saying that, look, Jammu Kashmir is an internal affair. Doesn't concern you. What we do is an internal arrangement. But if somebody says, you know, I go to Aksai Chin is with them, and I'm sworn to liberate Aksai Chin, then, you know, it's a red rag. I can agree with that. And that shouldn't have been done. But like Uday was saying, that this semaphoring of your resolve and of looking good in the strategic field is very important, because other countries, your investors, your global bankers, all decide about you by looking at this. Even modern economists, incidentally, I'll tell you, the last 3 economists who got the Nobel Prize got it for behavioral economics. Because the mood, the national mood then becomes very important for growth and for other kinds of reforms. If you don't have
one last, yes, forgive me, one last question I have to introduce to the panel, and I'll start with Commodore Bhaskar. We know that India is moving more and more troops to the border, mirroring the PLA or the Chinese army. In this situation, where at one point, and I've heard from people who are on the ground that emotions are very raw among our forces, that tensions are extremely high on both sides, that, you know, that troops are being moved to those borders. Is there room now to de-escalate, and how will both of these countries de-escalate? Will the solution here be diplomatic, as it has been in the last 3 occasions? Commodore Bhaskar.
Faye, one thing I always remind myself, saying that as a retired person, that when it comes to operational issues, you know, what should be done, what should not be done, I think it's above my pay grade. Meaning that people who are in the hot seat, they are able to have a better assessment about what needs to be done and how best it could be done. But I will make the following observation as a security analyst, that today, if the Indian military is looking at what kinds of responses it is capable of and giving this input to the government of the day, this is the correlate between the political objective and what the military can bring to the table. Now, our relationship with China is a complex relationship. It is not a binary way you can say that, yes, I will engage with China or I will not engage with China and turn the switch off. That is not an option. So under the circumstances, I think, you know, there has to be some kind of consensus within the country, not just the government. This is where the opposition parties and the entire country has to be, I think, brought on board and say that, yes, we have had a setback just now. I think I agree with Mohan here. It is a serious setback for us in SSN, that is subsector North. So what do you do with this? Is it possible now turn the flank, as it were, in terms of military jargon, and say that we look at some other military options, whether it's on land, it's on air or other, is a matter of choice for the professionals. But at the end of the day, I think what the country would also like to know and would be reassured is, what is your larger political objective? In Kargil, for Prime Minister Vajpayee, it was very clear. The political objective was to get the intruders out. And he announced to the world, I think the Stratcom at that time was more effective. He signaled to the world that we have a limited objective. The intruders who have come in have to be ejected. He also reassured them that there was no escalation, no reference to the nuclear issue, because we had tested just the previous year. So that particular objective was met with, of course, a very heavy cost in terms of lives lost by the Indian military, the army in particular. This time around, I think the Indian military, you know, would be assessing the situation. I'm sure they would be providing whatever options, but the clarity is required at the political level, meaning that if India is reasonably clear about the objective, then the options can be prioritized. And that is where I think we need to look at this in a very objective and calibrated way and take this forward. And some of the, you know, I would say extremely shrill jingoistic reactions, like throwing televisions down from multi-storied buildings and stomping on them, is, I think, just a very, very limited kind of, you know, I would say an emotive reaction at the level of, you know, whoever may be the most affected in that, wanting to get this particular point across. But the national response, I would submit with all humility, has to be less emotional, more calibrated about the big picture. India wants to be in the league of the three major macro economies of the world over the next 20, 20, 30 years, whatever it is. So how do you reach there, and what is the current situation?
Yes.
How do you use it? That's where I would leave it. Faye?
Yes. Thank you, Commodore. Professor Kondapalli, same question to you. At this point, is the solution now diplomatic? Because now we've tangled economically. There's a boycott China call that's happening. There's a lot of very shrill jingoistic things that are being said on Indian television. And I don't know how much of an impact you believe that has on any of what we've talked about so far. What do you think the options are for India on the table right now?
Faye, you have mentioned about the raising tempers on the borders. Let me remind you that soon after the incident or during the incident, when they were not, some of them do have some weapons, but none of them use the pistols or other weapons that they have. Secondly, the Indian side was treating in medical, giving medical attention to the injured Chinese, and the Chinese were doing the same to the Indian soldiers. They fought with each other a few hours before, but they were giving medical treatment to those injured. So that is what is prevailing on the borders right now. That is a rational calculus on both sides, which also means that they're not willing to cross the line in many ways. Unlike what we see in India-Pakistan borders, where you have the tempers are rising and also reflected in the brutality. We have seen for a moment the brutality, but there is again the rational calculus that has come about in the India-China parlance with this incident of providing medical support, where the military ethos on the Chinese part and the Indian part has come to the fore on providing relief to the other who is injured, although both were involved in the injury process. So I think we need to consider this, number one. Number two, in terms of where do we go now? I think today's meeting on disengagement possibly will provide for some clues. We do not know what exactly has happened, but possibly we will see the disengagement, de-escalation process. If the signaling from China and the signaling from the Prime Minister are true, then we will probably see some disengagement and de-escalation on the border. It will be extended to Pankung So Lake as well in terms of the, because when you look at the military solution, the second scenario, we don't see anything substantial, either the defeat of India or the defeat of China. We don't see such a scenario here. We will see possibly equal number of casualties and no major gains out of this conflict, military conflict, because of the narrow passages, and possibly India could inflict more casualties on China given its mountain warfare capabilities, which China does not have. So it is quite possible. But the calculation is nobody is a winner in this, because the second largest economy and the sixth largest economy, if they have to fight with all that they have in their inventory, I think we are going to see a total destruction on both sides. The rise of China and the rise of India are going to be, if it is not a limited conflict. That's a second scenario. A third scenario, obviously, is diplomacy, and that is where these signalings would matter. And possibly we will see some. On the last point, on the boycott of Chinese goods, I think this affects something like 3 to 4% of the total trade. It's not really much, because the bulk of the components are in power sector, in the API, pharmaceuticals, in machinery, and so on, which we are not manufacturing. and because of the cost factor, we are still dependent on China. Possibly there will be some mid-course correction in this, but it is for a long-term perspective rather than short to medium. So I do not think, remember during Doklam crisis, we also had this boycott of Chinese goods, but it just petered out in a few weeks after the Doklam crisis. So this is probably we are heading in the same direction. Although because of COVID-19, the supply chains are disrupted. The trade as such is falling for many countries, including between India and China.
Great. Very well said. Mr. Guruswamy, I have a combination of questions for you, if I may, along with what India's way forward is. I want to just put this up on the screen for our viewers to see. Global Times is considered the mouthpiece of the Chinese government. They put out an editorial where it said, and I quote, "I must warn Indian nationalists, if your soldiers cannot defeat Chinese soldiers in unarmed clashes, then guns and other firearms will not help them. The reason military strength of China is far more advanced and stronger than that of India." That's point number one, Mr. Guruswamy. The other is, we do know post-COVID, China's sort of economic strength has also been wobbly a little bit. They have a large number of people who are currently unemployed. And we also understand from some experts that the Chinese government is facing some domestic criticism, which is very rare in China, but they are facing domestic criticism with regards to the handling of this particular issue, specifically, like you said, downplaying their own casualties. Are there mistakes being made on the Chinese side as well that's weakening their stand? Have they made a few wrong moves here? And does that strengthen then India's position in our path going forward?
I think, you know, in the modern age, a general war is not possible. A general war is when all national resources are put on one adversary. In the modern age, only limited wars are fought. And your power at any given time is how much of force you can bring upon to bear on the battlefield. And as far as this battlefield and other battlefields nearby are concerned, India is pretty well placed and is comfortable. We got lulled into some complacency, like we got, and we should grab at straws. We didn't clutch at straws. Like Doklam, nothing really happened. They are where they are. They didn't go back. Much like they've built more helipads, they've got an airstrip going there now. They've got permanent structures, and they've not gone anywhere. But we sold a bill of goods to our people that the Chinese have pulled out. They haven't pulled out. And this is something which they will attempt again. They might give us some lollipops and saying, we're pulling out of the fingers, but you know, in Galwan, you yourself have accepted we have not crossed your line. So no, we have gone back to where we came from and still remain pretty much where we are. So I think this is something we should be wary about. I think we should, today, there was some clarity on this when the army commander said, our military commander said, you must go back to where you were in February or March. And that is important. And those locations can be fixed. We have satellite pictures, we have UAV pictures, we have everything which fixes locations where they were. I think we should use that and this time show some determination, not to pacify the people and somehow fob them off. I think a tendency to try to fob off people with some cock and bull story should be eschewed. As far as the economies are concerned, Srikanth is right. This business was, this what I call kachara trade, hardly accounts for 2-3%. Our big trade is in IT, in electrical goods, and in electronics, and in mobile communication. At this moment, there are few alternatives to the China supply lines. Unless, we build relationships with Taiwan and with Korea and create alternate supply lines. Even no more Apple phones, no more iPads, because everything comes made in Chengdu. You can't say that, an American company making his goods in China and exporting from China is excused. So there's a lot of complications in international trade. You have to deal with it more gingerly. And I think, the great lesson here is that we must learn from China. Their biggest adversary country is Japan. Every Chinese on the street hates Japan, but their biggest trading partner is Japan. The biggest foreign investor is Japan. The second country which they are more fearful of is the United States. And the United States is their biggest importer. And Taiwan, renegade province, is the second largest investor in China. So they're practical. Today the Maharashtra government did something extremely stupid by putting the $1 billion deal with 3 Chinese companies on hold. Who loses? A factory which is lying dormant in Talegaon is going to be dormant.
Yeah.
And local ancillaries will have no orders. We should act with enlightened self-interest. I think this is a lesson we have to learn from the Chinese.
Yes. All right. So that brings us to a very quick end to our 60-minute discussion. Gentlemen, thank you so much for sparing your time. I think it's very important here, and I can tell from the comment section that people have understood that there is a lot at play, other than just jingoistic nationalism of how we're going to give it back and we're going to, sort of sock them hard and that sort of thing. There is the economics of it, there's the diplomacy, there's the armed forces. And as informed citizens, it is our responsibility to make sure we're informed on all ends before we form our opinions. While I thank my panelists and I thank my, my viewers for coming in and watching, you've been an excellent audience. I must also point out to you, tomorrow afternoon at 12 exactly, Mr. Jaideep Ranade will be joining me, and he's also a expert on China. He'll join me for about half an hour. We'll talk about what's going on specifically as far as India's response to China. I thank you all for joining me, and I thank my panelists. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye, Uday. Bye, Srikanth.
Bye.